Hello, class. Welcome back. Now, we're in History 1301. This is Section 5. This will be 3 parts of Section 5. In this section, what we're going to talk about are the events that led to the American Revolution. Now, we know that we had Pontiac's Wars. Remember, you had the French and Indian War followed up by Pontiac's Wars. Then you had the American Revolution. Remember, we talked about in history, guys, it's like links in a chain. Each event leads to something else. The French and Indian War and Pontiac's War led to the British Crown having to tax the colonists. And that's what we're going to talk about. These events. Now, there's several different. One of the things I always like to point out, guys, and like I said, this is a 3-part series. And this one I want to kind of point out to you that I always tell my students, guys, that are taking me in this class, is the fact, guys, we always hear taxation. Taxation was the reason that the colonists went to war. It's taxation without representation. Now, who do they want to be represented by? They wanted representation in England. The thing I always tell my students, guys, the colonists considered themselves subjects of the English crown. They did not consider themselves colonists, or they were part of England. They took a lot of pride that they were English and they wanted to be represented. Okay. Now, and what we're going to kind of discuss it, guys, is England could have really maybe dismissed this whole thing if they would have given them representation in Parliament. That's really all they had to do, and they didn't. It kind of caused the whole thing to happen. Now, let's talk a little bit about these acts, what acts are and taxes. Now, the first one we're going to see, guys, is the Quartering Act. Now, always remember, I'm always looking at my PowerPoint as I'm talking. That's important, guys. I'm looking at my PowerPoint, okay? Now, first of all, what were acts? What were they? They were taxations, okay? So what they did was they came up with the Quartering Act. Now, this is the first of several of the acts that the British Crown will put onto the colonists. Always remember, guys, American history is taught by Americans for Americans. If you took this class over in England, they would quickly tell you, hold on, Americans, we set y'all up over there. We paid for y'all. We set up these colonies. They belong to us. All we want you to do now is to pay your own way. Now, something very important, guys, you realize that English men and women who lived over in England paid more tax than the colonists. The colonists had more children, they were wealthier, and they were actually physically bigger. They were healthier. So it's not like they were getting the short end of a stick. Okay, I always mention that. So we have this, it starts off with the Quartering Act. Now, the Quartering Act, like I said, that is an act where you would agree, or you were told, that you would house British soldiers. That's what you're going to do. You were going to house them. You were going to take care of them, put them in your house. Okay? A lot of resentment there. These are going to come under what's going to call the George Grenfell. The George Grenfell was prime minister. Remember, William Pitt was pretty popular. George Grenfell will not be as popular. Okay? Now, Grenfell will come up with what's called the Sugar Act. Now, the Sugar Act, it's the Sugar Act of 1764, the Sugar Act and the Molasses Act. What they're going to do, guys, is they're going to begin to tax sugar and molasses. That's all they're taxing. I always tell my students, guys, let's put this in perspective. If somebody came in, and if you're watching this from Texas or my home state of Louisiana, and they said, look, from now on when you go to Walmart, you don't have to pay tax on anything but sugar. You don't have to pay house tax, car tax, road tax, school tax, nothing. But if you buy sugar, we want you to pay a tax. Most people would say, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm in there. So they weren't asking a whole lot, okay? Now, the Sugar Act will fail, just like the rest of these. And this will follow up with the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act, guys, was a taxation on papers, documents, wheels, cards, all that. Now, I'm going to end this because in history, a lot of times we can't put things in perspective. When we talk about the paper, Most of my students, when I teach this class, I'll ask my students, raise your hand if anybody has read a paper in the last year. I'll probably have one guy, he raises his hand, he looks around, and nobody else got their hand, I'm putting mine down. To us, that's no big deal. The colonists were avid readers. So here's a little game I always like to put everything in perspective. Guys, if the government came up tomorrow and said, look, these little machines right here, every time you get on Google, every time you do a search, anytime you want to get on Facebook or whatever, you're going to pay a tax. Usually when I say this in class, my students' eyes get real big and they're like, oh, there'd be some problems. You have to put it, guys, the Stamp Act to the colonists were the same thing if they were to tax this for us, because they were avid readers of the paper. And now they're making them pay for information that they got free before. You know, guys, to wrap this thing up really quick, none of these taxes really will work. I think in the end, the English crown, out of all of them, get like $3,500. And they're like $7 million in debt. So none of it works. Now we're going to talk about some famous events. That Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre. And we're going to talk about a little guy that was center of all of it. Name was Samuel Adams. So we come back, part 2. We're going to talk about that little guy, Samuel Adams. See you then.